And so I just want to say thank you again so much for being here. Thank you, Wayne and Michael. And Wayne, you can take it away with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. And gonna see if I can pull up my presentation here today. And let's make sure we get this operating for starters here. Okay, does that look all right? Okay, so I thank you all for being interested in grizzly bear issues, transboundary issues here along the BC US border, specifically northern Idaho, northeast corner of Washington, northwest Montana. I primarily function in the Selkirk, Cabinet-Yaak, grizzly bear recovery areas, and I'm going to focus my discussion today largely on the Cabinet-Yaak. Give you, for starters, a little background on Cabinet-Yaak and where we are, and a little bit of geography. I'm going to talk next about the Cabinet Mountains Augmentation Program and a little background on the history of that and where we are today. I'm going to weave that into some biological discussion about connectivity of bear populations, and more specifically connectivity of the Cabinet-Yaak grizzly bear population, and some of the management things that we are doing in support of connectivity with a number of partners as well, including Y2Y. So for starters, a little bit of geography here. Cabinet-Yaak grizzly bear recovery area located in northwest Montana and a little bit of northern Idaho. It's kind of a elongate recovery area that's been identified, essentially running from the international border down to Thompson Falls, Montana. It encompasses roughly 2,600 square miles, which is largely U.S. Forest Service land. However, there are no national parks or large designated wilderness areas, so this area is a little bit unlike the Northern Continental Divide, the Yellowstone, the Bitterroot, the North Cascades. Both Selkirks and Cabinet-Yaak are smaller recovery areas, and at least on the US side and on the Canadian side, operate in kind of a multiple use landscape where there is a fair amount of roading, timber harvest, mining, other sorts of things that are going on the landscape as well. You know, I'm going to talk about the cabinets today, and when I refer to the cabinets or when I refer to the Yaak area is basically north of the Kootenai River and extends into British Columbia. It is the Yaak River drainage. When I talk about the Cabinet Mountains, which is going to be the focus of the next segment here, I'm referring to the area between the Kootenai River and the Clark Fork River, essentially extending from Bonners Ferry, Idaho, southwest down to Thompson Falls, Montana. And I bring up both of those because there are two somewhat different stories within those areas related to grizzly bears and grizzly bear biology. So move into the Cabinet Mountains, and just as some very background there, I did research in the Cabinet Mountains beginning in 1983 and published a final report in 1988. And some of the conclusions of that were that the population in the Cabinet Mountains portion of the Cabinet-Yaak was fewer than 15 individuals. We saw little observed reproduction in the 5 years of research that we conducted there. We saw high mortality rates from the collared animals. We did not observe any movement or linkage into other populations, and at the conclusion of the study, we recommended population augmentation, means of reducing mortality and increased habitat security for the area. For the augmentation, we proposed some test criteria under which we would move bears and attempt to augment the population. And that these criteria were such things that we would only use independent females, and by independent I mean roughly bears aged 2 to 5 prior to first reproduction. Bears would be backcountry animals with no history of conflicts with humans. They would be moved in mid-summer to take advantage of food supplies that are developing in the Cabinet Mountains. Those food supplies would largely be in the form of huckleberries. And furthermore, because of that, we were targeting donor areas for bears that had similar habitat and similar foods to make the transition for these bears as easy as possible. We also established 2 criteria for success in the augmentation program. And initially, we basically said that transplants must stay within the target area for at least 1 year. And this would be at least a preliminary sign of success of the program. Ultimately, of course, we want to see these females that we're moving reproduce, breed with native males, produce offspring. When we collar a young growing female, it's very difficult to keep a collar on those bears for very long. You know, typically we're talking about a couple years. And so that limits the radio monitoring window to judge success. And so we began to recognize that genetics and hair snagging to obtain genetics information was going to be one of the best ways that we could document the success of the program. So we did a test of the program where we initially put in 4 bears between 1990 and 1994. We ultimately saw success out of those 4 bears, and the program has continued since that time. We've added a total of 22 bears since 1990, predominantly females. And the map that you see on the screen represents the movements of some of those bears. Now, most of them have stayed within the target area, and you see the spaghetti lines overlapping extensively within the Cabinet Mountains. But there's been a few individuals that have left and either gone back home or taken off on various movements as well. So we know that at least 8 bears have left the target area, but 3 of those have actually returned to the target area after going on a walkabout. We know that 6 bears are dead, and you can see some of the causes there, a varied range of causes, not any one thing that is a mortality factor for these bears. We have documented at least 2 females and 1 male that are known to have reproduced, and I'll show you a little more evidence of that coming up here. But one thing I did want to point out is that people often see some of my maps and some of these things, and they see those lines going to the Northern Continental Divide from the Cabinet Yaak, and some people assume that that represents connectivity of these populations. Well, you know, successful genetic connectivity requires gene flow from a large population to a small population, and we weren't getting that. And that is why we put bears in a pickup truck and drove them to the Cabinet Mountains and released them there, was in order to provide an artificial form of gene flow. And again, we're continuing that here today. You can see, as I mentioned, you know, kind of some dramatic movements, and a couple of these are certainly noteworthy, and folks, I can possibly talk about those a little bit more when we get into the question and answer, but you can at least see a few of those bears went back home, and at least one notable one made it all the way down to the Selway Bitterroot, but then came all the way back. So the genetics program has provided us a interesting opportunity to look at lineages and family trees of some of these bears. So across the top, you'll see the 5 founders in these populations. And of course, you see that the blue squares are males, the pink circles are the females, and the lines emanating from those and ending up at a bear lower represents mom and dad and the offspring. And so from the 5 original bears in this population, CU29M and CUK39M were the original males in this population. And the other 3 represent augmentation bears that are known to have reproduced. But, you know, arising from these initial bears, we've had 14 first-generation offspring, 19 second-generation offspring, 3 third-generation offspring, and again, these represent minimums because these are the bears that we've been able to detect via the hair snagging program, or in a few instances, some captures. The one thing I would point out is that CU29M has been responsible for the vast majority of the breeding that's going on. And you can see that not only has he been breeding with, you know, numerous females, it's numerous females that are his offspring. And so there is a good opportunity for inbreeding, that sort of thing. CU29M was killed just this past year in the fall of 2019 after getting into a couple of different management episodes where he ultimately broke into a garage, broke into a cabin, a couple of other things that resulted in him being removed. Now, the loss of this particular bear, you know, some folks may regard that as unfortunate, but from a population standpoint, it's actually a relatively fortunate thing in that this will provide an opportunity for other males to enter the breeding population. So conclusions that I might draw, one thing that I think I've realized is from all the genetics work that we've been doing in the cabinets that my original estimate of 15 bears or fewer was probably a little generous. And at the time of the augmentation program starting in 1990, we were probably down to around half a dozen bears. Current population in the cabinets is estimated around 25 to 30. Obviously, we've got a ways to go, but it's showing some signs of progress and success. And augmentation is probably the main reason that we have grizzly bears remaining in the Cabinet Mountains today. We've certainly seen some other bears getting into the cabinets from a few other places, not very many, but we have not seen any reproduction out of any of those animals yet. We will be continuing the augmentation program at a slow pace. We're hoping to move another female in there this year. The caveat on this that you can see at the bottom there is, and this is true of almost all animal transplantation programs, is they don't all stay where you put them and they don't all live. So we do utilize telemetry through radio collaring bears, excuse me, and our genetics program to try and gauge the level of population expansion or connectivity. And, you know, this often occurs with dispersing individuals getting into another population or coming from another population. And at least in the case of bears, particularly grizzly bears, it's young males that tend to move long distances away from their natal range. Females, on the other hand, typically tend to adopt a home range that is either part of mom's home range or an area adjacent to that. And so what I'd like to do is maybe present a little bit of a biological example from the yak area where we've had some long-term research that kind of demonstrates that. So the map that you see on the screen here represents a female grizzly bear that's basically a founder in the yak population. And maybe I need to point out a little geography. The horizontal line a little above midway is the United States-Canadian border. The vertical line on the somewhat left center represents the Idaho-Montana border. You can see Libby near the bottom of the screen, Bonners Ferry to the left-hand side, and that's Koocanusa Reservoir on the right. And so just, again, a little bit of geographic reference there. This bear, this is the radiolocation points and the approximate home range of this bear. She was first captured in 1986. She wore a radio collar for much of her life until 1999. And so this just gives you an idea of this particular bear's home range. Okay, so the next thing that I've got here are the female offspring, the 5 female offspring that we know Bear 106 produced. And these represent the radio locations and any data that we have on those 5 females. And you can see how their home range encompasses part of their mother's home range as well as some expansion out on the periphery. Now, because of the long-term research program that's been going on here, we can actually show another generation of bears. And so the yellow line and the yellow points represent all the female offspring, of which there are about 10, from the green points and the females in generation 1. And so you can also see, again, a little expansion as well as overlap of their mom's home range as well as their grandmother's home range. We've actually got to start on a third generation as well. And there's only 3 bears in this so far. But again, the purple line and those females, those purple points represent bears that are the offspring of generation 2 above the ones documented by the yellow line. We're seeing some expansion in all directions, but again, it dramatizes often, not always, but often the way female expansion occurs in grizzly bear populations. We are seeing movement expansion to the south, and I am hopeful that in the next decade we will get bears crossing the Kootenai River, moving to the south, female bears, and getting into the Cabinet Mountains and seeing some interchange back and forth between these 2 segments. Okay, a few basics on connectivity here. Connectivity, is often a product of fracturing, typically caused by highways, human habitation, human development, and it produces a variety of demographic and genetic consequences in that you don't see the gene flow between some of these, and you may not even see movement of bears and potential rescue effects from bears getting from one either population or getting into new habitat to colonize new habitat. And so these kinds of things represent at least an issue for bears, and the question is whether it becomes a barrier or whether it's simply a bottleneck. And so Michael and obviously several others here developed an approach to trying to look at where some of the connectivity might apply around the Cabinet Yaak. And this was done largely by using the telemetry, using the habitat use, and looking at human habitation and human development along many of these highways and corridors, transportation corridors, and where would be some of the most likely places that, given that kind of information, where we expect to see bears get across these valleys. In many of these places, it's not only a highway. For instance, there might be railroads, there might be various levels of human habitation, not to mention different ownership patterns that allow or might be a little tougher for conservation to occur. However, there are approaches that we can use, and the blue in here represents conservation easements that have been acquired over the last 15, 20 years or so, and some, as I say, easements and acquisitions in an attempt to protect some of these linkage areas. Many of the easements in this area have been with a large industrial timber company, and that would be Stimson Lumber. The easements at least limit, I won't say preclude, but limit subdivision development, selling off of that property. There are also portions or things in the easement that limit open road density. We then target some of these areas with prevention actions to secure attractants. For instance, provide opportunities, grants, know-how for electric fencing, trying to essentially protect animals that might venture into these linkage areas to ensure they don't die there, that they have the ability to get across these fractures and hopefully survive and reproduce on the other side and result in connectivity across these bottlenecks or these transportation corridors. So, another aspect of this is tracking individual animals and trying to see a little bit about the success of some of these programs. So each one of these arrows represents an individual bear that we're aware of that has moved from its origin into the point of the arrow. And so we've documented a number of movements over the last 30 years of bears getting into the Cabinet Mountains, and that's what I'm focusing on with this particular graphic, is to look at movements into the cabinets in support of connectivity and, of course, in support of genetic diversity. And so there are a number of animals that have moved in. However, just movement is only a small part of the picture. If that movement ends up in mortality or a bear leaving, again, before it actually reproduces, then, the movements are of little population significance. I mean, it's important that we can document that bears are getting there, but getting there is only part of the answer here. Getting there and reproducing is really what we need to have gene flow. And so if we look specifically at the animals that we believe have survived, you know, the sample size becomes a good deal smaller. And it becomes even smaller still when we look at animals that have moved and are known to have reproduced, essentially creating that gene flow that we're after into this population. The upside is that we're starting to see it, and that's important. We still need to possibly address some issues related to bears getting here and dying before they can reproduce. And so, you know, constraints on mortality, habitat protection are still important issues. But at the same time, I would also suggest that we are having some success and that we are at least on the right track here. So I'd like to end here with a short story. I did document or talk about female movements. I'd like to give you a little bit of a story here about another bear that is a young male that has demonstrated some dispersal on a little bit different sort of scale. So we're going to be talking about bear 1006, who was born in the Selkirks in 2016. And you can see we have a family tree where we know that this particular bear, we can trace her lineage all the way back through her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother back into the late 1970s, early 1980s in the Selkirk Mountains. We do know from the genetics program that her father, or his father, actually migrated from the Purcells, bred with a female there to produce bear 1006. 1006 was captured as a yearling in 2017 as part of a trapping effort or a radio collar, denned in the Selkirks in the winter of 2017 and 2018, and then moved into the Cabinet Yaak. And on the right, you see a map that indicates the path of that bears, and there's radio locations along the way, where the bear traveled through the Yaak and traveled down into the Cabinets, and spent a lot of time, particularly on the east side of the Cabinet Mountains, until late October of 2019 when it lost its radio collar. Excuse me, 2018, when it lost its radio collar. And so at that point, we had no knowledge of this particular animal and what was going on with it. However, until 2019. And there were several photos obtained of a grizzly bear near Grangeville, Idaho. At one of those sites, we obtained DNA in the form from hair, and it was identified as bear 1006. In some of the pictures, maybe not the ones here or not with this magnification, you can actually see an ear tag in the bear's ear that it wore. And so we do know that 1006 made it to Grangeville, Idaho. Now, some of you may be asking, where the hell is Grangeville, Idaho? So Grangeville, Idaho is approximately 260 miles south of where it lost its radio collar. In central Idaho, there's a town there called Grangeville, and that's kind of our association with geography here. But there were also another sighting or a picture of a grizzly bear in 2019. Couldn't necessarily say for sure it was the same bear, but there were also tracks of a grizzly bear this spring in April, and there was some hair obtained at that site as well, all within the same general vicinity. We hope to get the DNA processed and know whether this is bear 1006 or represents another bear in that area. But I provide this as kind of a little information sharing, as well as just another example of how males can disperse long distances, but it is far more unusual for a female to do something like that. You know, folks, that's what I've got for you here today. I appreciate your interest in grizzly bears and grizzly bear biology and connectivity here. I think there'll be an opportunity for questions later on. But again, appreciate you all being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Yeah, and I think we'll just transition right into Michael's presentation and then do some questions and discussion at the end.
So I'm sharing my screen. I'll see if it works here. Has it worked?
I'm not, I can see your screen. It looks like you're pulling up your PowerPoint. Yep.
Okay, so you can see my screen. We're good to go. I will get her started. The first thing I apologize for is the angle of my camera. You're going to get a good view of my Adam's apple. I'm sorry about that. It's down at the bottom of my computer. So also, this is a bit of a long, drawn-out title. I gave this talk, a portion of this talk in Slovenia a year ago, and I really wanted it to highlight that there was several things going on in this talk about conflict management and the network of organizations that went into a lot of this work we're going to talk about today, and how we're sort of starting to reverse conservation decline. What was really great about Wayne's talk is he talked about some of the mechanisms of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about an analysis we did, Wayne and I and a group of people, about 15 years worth of work, and sort of look at it from a bigger picture. What Wayne did was give us some of the details of how animals disperse, and it was pretty interesting stuff. That's really where the fun stuff is. I'm gonna probably put you all to sleep here. But anyway, there's a lot of authors or people who worked with us in this, and their names are at the bottom, but I'm also just going to show you their pictures just for the fun of it. We have James Barber, the BC Conservation Officer Service, and Kim Annis, the Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and Harvey Locke, and Nancy Newhouse, and Jillian Sanders. These are some of the people that were part of our larger network and team that made what I'm going to report here, a lot of this possible. And just as to step back a little bit, connectivity has been blossoming around the world as a conservation concern. And this slide was made about 5 or 6 years ago, and now there's probably double or triple these number of large-scale conservation connectivity projects. Many of them centered on carnivores, but you can see lions in Africa and jaguars in South America, and here's Y2Y up here, one of the founders and beginning projects to put this idea on the map around the world. Anyway, we're going to zero in on our region, of course, and this is you can see the bear distribution in North America, sort of the current or rapidly, or not rapidly, but slowly changing, expanding distribution. And this Y2Y region really covers, there's really a synergy or a synchronicity with grizzly bear distribution and the whole Yellowstone to Yukon, and I think it's been one of their focal species for good reason. But these are the highways, the major highways that have acted as fractures, and it's not so much the highways as Wayne suggested, but the people living along those highways. And this is sort of where all the action is in terms of Y2Y and where it's been, and we work down here. We're getting smaller and smaller. And so we're going to zero in on what we've been doing in this area, but all what we do here can apply in the future, and it probably is beginning to be copied and applied elsewhere across some of those highways, across the Y2Y. So I'm going to sort of give you a schematic of how things operate in my limited mind. You sort of have conservation issues of fragmentation and habitat ineffectiveness when maybe there's too many roads or backcountry mortalities, and low declining population size. These are threats to grizzly bear populations in our region. And in a somewhat simplistic way, human bear conflicts underpin a lot of the problems in the front country and the backcountry that create these issues for bears. But as we work to reduce human bear conflicts in the backcountry and the front country, we, of course, it can increase tolerance with the public, and people tolerate bears more because we've reduced the conflict. But also we end up increasing connectivity and habitat security, and then we increase those sustainable populations. And we eventually can lead to recovered sustainable populations. That's sort of the paradigm with which we're working a little bit, just to give you an overall feel for how it fits together. Of course, the fly in the ointment is to manage wildlife. You really have to manage habitat, and you have to manage people. And that really is where things get challenging. But if you get some good moosehead deer, you can you can get some moose to help manage the hunter population really well. And we've capitalized that up here in Canada. At any rate, today I'm going to talk about sort of those same conservation issues, fragmentation and human caused mortality and habitat quality and security. Sort of briefly, we had talking about a 15-year program here and how we've measured its biological impact after that time. So the first thing, many of you have seen this graph ad nauseum. I apologize that you're seeing this graphic one more time, but this is a fragmentation map of the region, and the yellow dotted lines represent sort of limited female movement. And in the case of the southern Selkirks, where it's actually, in the old days, there was actually no males or females moving into that population. So it was fully isolated in about the same manner that Yellowstone was. But those fragmentation lines are not complete. They're just sort of partial fragmentation. But you can, so what I've been doing, I've met up with Kasworm and crew in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from my Kaslo office here in Canada. I decided to team up with them and try to work and understand bears and let the bears teach us how we could get them moving between these, across these yellow dotted lines, and link up the smaller populations to the larger subunits where they're healthier and doing a little better. And that was sort of our long-term goal. And what was causing those fragmentation, that fragmentation is often mortality associated with conflicts. A bear who breaks into a house like this, sort of a death sentence. We're not going to tolerate that in society. This bear, on the other hand, dug this little hole in the yard and got killed for no reason. So we get justified mortality and some unjustified mortality in there. But we wanted to go in and try to manage that and improve people's relationship with wildlife. This is a map of non-hunt mortality in British Columbia and a little bit into the States there over like 25 years. And it sort of created these walls of mortality. You can see it's hard for a bear to get from the Rocky Mountains into the Purcells and the Yak to get through this river of humanity where bears tend to get lured into chicken coops and fruit trees, and even some salmon streams get killed. And these walls of mortality are the source of this fragmentation over the time. But I do want to point out, in our area, the backcountry mortalities are almost equal to the front country mortalities around here. So it's also an arena that we need to consider. So Wayne and I, in their shop, we joined forces and we started radio collaring bears with the idea of trying to predict these linkage zones so we can try to let the bears teach us where the best places to put connectivity management in place strategically. You can see after 25 years, you get a lot of data points. It looks like the bears are everywhere, and they do go everywhere. But remember that each dot is pretty wide on the scale of this map. But so then we take all that and we do some mathematical modeling of habitat selection, and we get a map like this. So the green here represents the better habitat patches, and the yellow, which Wayne showed earlier, is the predicted corridors between the better habitat patches across the highways. And this is where we strategically locate our management efforts. We can't manage everywhere, so we can just manage in these places. That was the plan. So during that time, I'm going to tell you what we did. I sort of picked out this area to try to go in and manage intensively and to see if I could actually get bears moving, sort of like this was my dream, where they'd move from the Purcells, this large, somewhat healthy population, into the Selkirks, and then down into the United States and back into the cabinets. And this is what Wayne and I have been thinking about for 15 years. So we're going to just talk about how that might have worked out. This is just a little more of a detail. Some of that modeling shows the yellow is just sort of a generalized view, but when you go in and look closer, the darker red and blue flames shows where the real action for grizzly bear corridor is based on habitat use from telemetry data. And so there's a real strong corridor here south of Kootenai Lake above Creston. And then there's some other corridors into the United States between the Yak and the Selkirks. And so we applied conflict, or we initiated and worked with, I don't work for anyone, but I worked with the BC government to initiate some conflict management. Wayne is the government in the state, so he could work a little more directly on management. And so we did a lot of front country management. We purchased private lands for connectivity. We did non-lethal management. We did electric fencing program and bear container programs and garbage bin programs and bear safety and stuff. And in the backcountry, we used access management, which has been pretty well used in the States, but not so well in Canada. And of course, they have some excellent backcountry regulations of food storage down there. So the point is here that we did a comprehensive program, just not one pill to swallow to fix this. We had to work on everything. And just go through real briefly some of here's some of the results over the years. I think this map is growing. This map might be a few years old. There's more properties been purchased, sort of a large network of land trusts. Yellowstone to Yukon has been involved, even though they're not a land trust. They've got involved in a lot of the fundraising. They've been completely essential in this program, and they've helped a lot of these other places raise money. And we've raised roughly around $50 million worth of land for direct purchase and conservation easements, and about 210 square kilometers of directly sort of protected with connectivity in mind. A bit amazing that this has taken place over this large area, and it's still growing, it's still happening. As Wayne showed some more properties, I think, that I don't even have on this map. The other thing we did was non-lethal management, which has been practiced in Montana for decades, and I brought it to BC. It was only partially used here, and we've go in and find what I call conflict light bears and manage them instead of kill them and turn them off of a life of crime, if you will. And we have a pretty interesting success rate, and success here is only defined by them staying out of trouble during the life of their radio collar. Some of these bears maybe have stayed out of trouble for a year or two, but eventually got in trouble again and were killed. But a pretty decent success rate, and it shows that it really is worth trying. And also the cool part of this is there's sort of another universal truth in here that the females seem to be a little quicker to learn. And I think that's a cross species characteristic. I think at least in humans it is for sure. I can say this from direct experience. But at any rate, we've done this in conjunction with a conservation officer service, and this has really sort of taken off in British Columbia. It's being practiced now at a much higher rate. It's pretty cool. We also have a very intensive and aggressive, if you will, electric fencing program. I know Defenders of Wildlife has a similar program in the States, and also Kimanis, where we have a 50% cost share. We've put up quite a few fences. It works amazingly well. And of course, we're trying to get bears to move back through human settled valleys, so there's always a risk to human-bear conflict and potential injury. So we put on annual or semi-annual bear fairs where we really teach people how to use bear spray and about bear safety. It's really important to give them tools. We manage all sorts of types of risk. We manage driving risk and airline safety, and we manage a lot of things. And nowadays we manage COVID safety, but we can also manage bear safety, and people are empowered by that given the proper tools. Works pretty good. In the backcountry, we took our program to try to understand bears' most important food supply, as Wayne mentioned, huckleberries in our region. So we modeled and tried to understand where are the best huckleberry patches so we could fine tune our management. So we modeled huckleberry plants, which are sort of everywhere, which is not a very useful map. But then we followed the bears and used their telemetry data to have them teach us where the most important patches that they used are, which turned out to be kind of a smart little idea because it's a very small subset of where their plants are. And this is turned out to be a very highly predictive map. We're publishing another monograph right now about it. It ends up predicting everything female grizzly bear, their density, their habitat use, and even their fitness. We have a fitness surface. So it was pretty useful, but what we use it for is to identify areas where we should have more access management within Canada. And this is a trick map. In the previous map, huckleberries were purple. Now huckleberries are green. So sorry, that's just to make sure that you guys are all paying attention. And this is the Southern Selkirks in Canada. And this is the Darkwoods Nature Conservancy land that they purchased for conservation purposes. And the red are some of the roads that they've closed and have been closed for over a decade. And it just so happens they really overlap this high density of huckleberry patches. It wasn't really done on purpose. It just sort of a chance thing. But it opened up an opportunity for some experimentation and study design and comparing. So we compared bear use and fitness and density females in this area where we had high huckleberry patches and road closures with other areas, even in the Purcells all around. And it was really, they imply we could compare and assess the effects of motorized access and seeing what was going on. So, you know, it's just a quick look at fragmentation and connectivity, et cetera. And we sort of covered all three of those. So now we're just going to look at, so how did all that work? Did it, you know, we went in then and measured, did we actually increase connectivity? Did we decrease mortality and increase the population? So now I'm just going to look real quickly at how did that work? And it looks like, so we'll start right here because this is the most complicated map. I apologize for the spaghetti, but what we did find comparing this area to other areas of a lot of similarities in a big modeling exercise, and we're just about to publish this, is we found higher density to females and higher reproductive rates in those areas, particularly associated with the high huckleberry and the low road density. The combination turned out to be particularly important for those areas. A pretty significant analysis, kind of cool. Within Canada, I'm just showing the South Selkirk Canadian population here where I have my own data. Pre-2006, before we got started on a lot of these programs of implementation management, we had an increase in this non-hunt mortality. And then you can see after 2006, it's not a perfect graph, but it's a nice inflection point where we're starting to see that decline in human-caused mortality. And to convince myself that that was real, I went over to the adjacent valley in the Fernie, Sparwood, Elkford area. And that's just where those same management activities were not applied, and the management is continuing to increase there. So it made me feel like that this trend is kind of real. And as for measuring connectivity, there's several ways we looked at that. As Wayne said, movement does not mean gene flow and connectivity particularly, but it gives us a sense. So here's a bear that radial collar moved from the yak in Canada over all the way into the state of Washington, where we picked up its collar 2 years later. As we have several bears that have moved into that thing. Wayne was talking about that. This is another way we look at it. This is we look at genes, genetics, and we can see where a bear was born. Just like I can tell if someone's ancestry was from Africa or Europe or China, we can tell if a bear's ancestry is from the Selkirks with these red, or across the Crescent Valley and the Kootenai Valley in the Purcell Mountains. You can see the bears. So pre-2006, we had a few migrants. You can see these bears that poke out into which were captured. This bear was captured in the Purcells, but its genes really came from the Selkirks. And post 2006, you can see now we have several migrants that have moved into the Selkirks from the Purcells. So this allows us to do this without the benefit of telemetry. We're using genetics to find their home population. And another really interesting one, and Wayne will show you some data on this in a different context, but it's really one of the more exciting things we've done. This is where we have pedigrees and we have family units where we have mom, dad, and the kids, a perfect genetic match, and we can see into their, basically looking into bear sex lives. Quite fun if you're otherwise bored. But so here we have Bob and Maeve, who we radio collared, and they met in the Purcells within Canada, and they begat Captain Hook, who moved into the Selkirks. And then Captain Hook proceeded to meet up with 4 or 5 Selkirk females and had about 5 or 10 kids. So this is real gene flow. This is movement and sex across the Crescent Valley. And so we're really excited to be monitoring this and showing, and this population in the Selkirks was really isolated for up to 60 years with no gene flow for quite a long time. It was a very strong signal. So this really represents a big change in the way things are going. And you can put this together with the patterns Wayne was seeing. We're looking at a potential for the cabinets and possibly even the bitterroots over some time. And there's some other family groups that we've identified some migrants, but this one was sort of a dramatic display, pretty cool. So the cumulative evidence in this paper, Wayne showed you some more detail about it in the cabinets, but this is sort of the cumulative evidence pre-2006. And it's not just a matter of us looking more after 2006. At 2006, we had a lot of data to put into this very thin graph. But in post 2006 to 2017, we had a pretty significant incline, and you can see some of those bears have died, this or that, but the point is that it looks like it's really happening. We are starting to see this. We're starting to solve this problem. For some of you more science nerds, not only do we see gene flow and a little bit of population rescue, we're also seeing an increase in genetic variability into the cell curves. This is really hard to measure and a very slow moving metric biologically, but we're seeing their heterozygosity increase in 13 of 15 loci, and we're also seeing a significant increase in number of alleles. These are just some genetic metrics that may not mean much to anybody, everyone, but it does suggest that we're actually not only saving the population, but also measuring an increase in genetic variability. We haven't shown a problem with genetic variability, but we're just measuring its increase. So Wayne and I's little dream of having bears come down into the cells, into the cell curves, and potentially get down into here is starting to come true. It's somewhat exciting. This is all published in a paper, Human Wildlife Interactions, in 2018. You guys can it's open access, so just look it up, Proctor and Kasworm and Grizzly Bears, and you'll find this paper. You can download it. And if you have trouble sleeping at night, it'll help you get to sleep. We send it to people with insomnia. So I'm just going to dip into the future a little bit here, where we're going from now within Canada. We are, even though we're reporting that we're showing good increase in connectivity, we want to show the whole, we want to assess the conservation status of the Selkirks in the Canada to show that, or to assess and measure the conservation increases, improvements we find. So we're doing a large DNA survey across the Canadian portion of the full ecosystem. We had to split our money between 2 years. So this is what we're doing this year. We have one site down here where we got 60 DNA samples on the first night. It's kind of amazing. So some of the team is out there right now while I'm sitting here in the office. And so these are all the sites we're putting a DNA site at to collect hair. Next year, we'll be doing this region. And it's not that the US is too cheap to do their own survey. They've actually been, Wayne has been doing a very good job without an official one-year survey. These are the DNA sites that they've been collecting over the last few years. So they've already got a mountain of data. So eventually we'll be able to combine the international data and come up with a very good assessment of what's happening in the southern Selkirks. They've got an amazingly cool results from a combination of rub trees, cameras, and some DNA sites, but without having a formal survey, which I think is a good way to look at long-term monitoring. They've been doing a good job down there. So we're going to combine our data. And we're also going to put out, Wayne has provided us from some remote cameras, and these are sort of bear management units. We're going to put out several cameras and DNA sites over the long term here. So we're going to join up with, join forces with Wayne's long-term monitoring of female reproduction over. And we'd like to, if anybody from the Colville National Forest is listening, thank you for those cameras you're donating up here to Canada. We're putting them out right now. And all these metrics that we've are measuring in this project are designed to assess metrics that Grant McCutcheon and I laid out in a management plan for the South Selkirk population in Canada. It's an official government document. They don't call it a recovery plan, so they're a little, you know, I don't work for the government, so I can say this out loud. They're nervous about having it be an obligation, but really is a recovery plan, whether they want to say it or not. And they know that. It's just what it is advice to science, and they're helping us now cooperatively. We're all working together to implement a lot of these things. And the reason we're pushing forth with this is the old BC conservation ranking system of the population units. And you can see that some of these populations were been determined as threatened over the long haul over many years, but we've rehashed that. This is an old system that's not all that scientifically credible. And we rehashed it. I was part of a team that built it this year. We have a new system now where we assess the conservation status of bears population units in BC. And you can see that red is very threatened. These populations have less than 10 animals in them, so this is highly threatened. The orange is the next level where they're not using threatened. Those names have so much baggage and danger. What we're calling them is populations of concern. So these are high concern. This is concern. And we've also, you can see that there's more populations being added to this. And there's a lot of objective, measurable metrics that went into these assessments. And then you can see the yellow is, you know, mild concern, green is good, and dark green is excellent. But the point is, look at the, if you would call, I would call this an A grade, I would call this a B grade, I would call this a C grade, and a D and an F. So even though, so the point is, if you're a C, you probably want to do better. If your kids are in school and they're coming back with a C average, you're going to go, hey, how about getting that up to a B? So I think that some of the management that we've been applying down here in southern British Columbia and into the States, one of the reasons that I'm excited about doing this DNA survey is I want to say to the rest of British Columbia, you guys could use the benefit of some of those programs to improve the conservation status of a whole lot of population units across BC. I'm sort of done with the bear part of this talk, so I'm going to spend a few minutes, just probably 5 minutes, winding up with sort of the evolution of my work in terms of connectivity and implementing long-term solutions on our landscape. I'm 70, and Wayne's not far behind. I plan on doing other things for the rest of my life, so I'm trying to set up some programs where these connectivity management schemes are built into the fabric of society, so it's not just biologists pushing for it all the time. So here's a little story about what we've done. This is a Crescent Valley management area, sort of the scene of where a lot of the stuff that I talked about earlier has taken place. And you can notice it's a really big, large wetlands. And here it is here, the Crescent Valley, and this is down into the States, down into the Bonners Ferry area. And some of the patterns we've noticed over time is a high proportion of species at risk other than bears are also found on private lands in BC, which are of course generally found in the valley bottoms in our mountainous habitats. And the federal government, this Environment Canada Climate Change, also found the same thing, that a lot of the endangered species and species at risk are on those private lands. And here's a map of the private lands in those areas within Canada and in the British Columbia. And you can see that this is the arena of connectivity conservation. This is the arena that's fragmenting this, but it's also the arena of other conservation issues that have big significant problems. And when we consider grizzly bear is an umbrella species, they really are, well, a good umbrella species for connectivity for sure. And so I started thinking about this a few years ago, and this is sort of course, the wildlife management area that was sort of stuck in all this private land. Is what we had to start with work with in our grizzly bear corridor. So this is where our grizzly bear corridor is right here. So there's a little cool sub-story underneath the grizzly bears here that's pretty neat. This is a northern leopard frog study area. It's the threatened northern leopard frog in Canada. This is its only population in Canada left. It's a population that's more prevalent in the States. But up here, it's big business for a conservation story. And there's also a little leopard corridor here. They go between their some of their breeding grounds, so the overwintering grounds, and some foraging grounds and breeding grounds. So they move between these little areas right here, this little cute leopard frog. And this also happens to be the arena where we bought a lot of lands for our grizzly bear. This is some of the NCC lands we purchased for grizzly bear connectivity. But as you can see, they're really a nice overlay for these leopard frogs. It's a pretty cool story. And of course, this is right where our grizzly bear corridor is. So this started occurring to me that there was possibly a link between riparian wetland areas and grizzly bear corridors. It's just a little light bulb went off my head about 4 or 5 years ago. And so we ended up thinking about this with some John Krebs of the BC government. We sort of gave it a name called the Frog Bear Natural Area. We're trying to blow it up into bigger than bears so it would encompass the larger scope of nature. And it really has been a benefit to the leopard frogs. So eventually, after all the work we did on bears and leopard frogs and a bunch of things, the Nature Conservancy bought a bunch of land. They've created this frog bear conservation area down on the Crescent Flats. And this is a big, huge sign that sits down there. It's got an explanation of how all of us have worked on it. And it's the community now sees their little region as this wildlife corridor that's bigger than bears. And it's been pretty effective at bringing in other portions of society that care about things other than bears and birds and species at risk and amphibians and reptiles and ungulates. It's a pretty amazing story. So what I did then, I started thinking, you know, because we had that map of corridors all across our large region, as I got to know the region more recreationally and professionally working, I started thinking I would do a little analysis. I took all the riparian layers that we built in GIS. We built a whole riparian layer that identifies wetlands and riparian across the region. And I took the grizzly bear corridors that Wayne showed you first, that we always tend to put in yellow, and hooked up, and I did an overlay on them, and they overlapped. And I thought, wow, okay, here they're overlapping really well. And then I did that across the whole region, and I found, wow, there's an amazing synergy between grizzly bear corridors and these big wetland hotspots across here. And it just started growing in my mind that there was an important story here. So I just had this idea to talk to lots of people about it, and sort of got nowhere, about establishing these larger corridor designations where we manage and recognize them. We don't have a designation for that. We have parks and we have other things, but we don't have a corridor designation. But they're not really parks. They're a combination of private and public lands. And it's a real complex thing to try to put together and understand, but I just thought I wouldn't let that stop me. So we invented, Juliet Craig, I think, is on this, people on this webinar, and Marcy Marr may not be, but a bunch of us got together drinking some beer, as all good ideas emanate from, and we created Kootenai Connect one day, where we're looking at blowing up grizzly bear corridors into riparian wildlife corridors. And there's a link for climate change. And, you know, we tried to, it was basically a study in buzzwords. We could try to get as many buzzwords as we possibly could. But we went for some funding to the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program to get started, to see if we could develop this idea. That's all we wanted to do, was 3 years of planning. And then we had another opportunity came along with our federal government. And because it had this broader scope and with species at risk and landscape connectivity, we secured a $2 million grant, which, you know, my only lesson here is watch what you wish for, because it's been a major effort. So we're in the middle of doing this. We just finished year one on both of these. So we're actually now out implementing these restoration and a bunch of different things. And these are the large corridors that we're working on around the region within Canada. We've, just to simplify this, we can't work on everything, but we're picking up, they selected these focal areas. And these are all important grizzly bear corridors, and they're all important species at risk wetland riparian corridors as well. Here's just a little more specific study areas. We've defined the areas pretty well. I'm not gonna tell you all the things we did, but here's just a look at all the 4 areas, and these are the species at risk and how many endangered, threatened, and special concerns there are federally, and then provincially. They really are the hot spots for species at risk and things beyond grizzly bears. It's really amazing the things we've encountered. I won't go through this in detail, but we're into wetland restoration and hydrologic connectivity for wetlands, getting the water flowing, slowing down water flow for easing, improving flood maintenance for climate change. There's a whole bunch. There's no end to the amount of things that are interrelated and integrated. It's really true ecology. And we're linking it up through grizzly bears, up through western toads, and a lot of the animals that use the lowland and the highland. We've integrated NCC, as you've already seen. We're doing a lot of different things. So it's pretty exciting. It's not just us 3, Marcy and Juliet and I. We've got all these organizations that work fully. And this is a list of people and biologists that work with us. And not just a list of people we talk to occasionally. Most of these people we talk to a lot. They're really fully engaged. It's really become a regional machine in itself. We just put out our year 1 annual report of a lot of the things we've accomplished. A lot of it is planning, but we've had some really on the ground implementations, successes. And, you know, the hope is that eventually we will get some type of established wildlife corridors that integrate the larger nature. And it all sort of grew from a seed of grizzly bears 15 years ago from when Wayne and I were talking, drinking beer at an IBA many, many years ago. So it's a fun story, and that's basically my spiel here today. Thanks very much for listening. And of course, like a lot of this stuff, it takes a lot of funders, and we appreciate them all. And hopefully, Jesse, your children take over this project as I retire here pretty soon. All right, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful. And thanks again, Wayne, as well. I think I've heard you both present probably at least 20 times in my life, and I always learn something new. So
we apologize for that. I'm sorry you had to hear that so many times.
I feel lucky. Okay, so we can take a few questions now, and if people have questions that they've been saving, please send them in. But we do have a handful here, so we can start with that. And I think we'll just start out with, there's been a lot of interest and talk recently about grizzly bears moving south into the Bitterroot and central Idaho. I think a lot of us who follow this have seen it in the news recently, and a lot of people wondering about, there's been a couple males, what does the future hold? And so I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to briefly speak to that. Maybe we can start with Wayne, and then Michael, you can chime in as well.
Well, certainly we're seeing some movements, particularly between the yak and the cabinets. I have a program where I've emphasized linkage internally first. Kind of my first priority has been looking at linkage between the yak and the cabinets. My second priority is between the cabinet yak and other recovery areas, but trying to address internal linkages for starters. I would say that, with our previous information based on collaring and other information from bears, that we were not really seeing much for bear movements very near the Kootenai River until about the last 5 to 7 years. And in the last 5 to 7 years, we have seen bears move to and across the Kootenai River, either north to south or south to north, and that's encouraging. We have not yet seen reproduction by some of those bears, but given the time frame of this, and some of this is occurring because of population pressures, where populations are growing on each side. And as you saw with female distribution, bears are expanding and moving into other parts of the recovery area that maybe didn't hold bears or didn't hold very many bears in the past. And so we're seeing them grow together. And I am encouraged. We've had a program with Stimson, a willing major industrial landowner, where there have been easements acquired. Y2Y and Vital Ground have accumulated a couple of other acquisitions in the area. And so, I'm encouraged by what's been going on there. While I can't point to complete success, I see the signs of improvement, and hopefully in the next decade, we can show bears that have moved and reproduced and created that gene flow that we're after.
Thanks.
Do you want me to chime in or anything?
Yeah, if you have something to add.
When I started working bears in 1995, I think I got into this area in 1997, the South Selkirk was 100% isolated, and it had been for decades. The genetic signal was just overwhelming, and we were all a little bit shocked because it's only across 5 or 7 kilometers of valley. And so we started all these programs, and we've started to see it happening. We even have now evidence of a female moving into the Selkirks and reproducing. We're pretty excited. And one of the reasons that it, I think, happened first up in Canada there in the Selkirks was we actually had a lot more bears there. What Wayne's doing is absolutely heroic. He's not only trying to develop connectivity, but he's developing connectivity to a population of 6 in the 1990s. So the population in the Selkirks was very low, but it was never that low. And we think it got down into the 15 or 20, 25. But so they're doing, and we're all, both us in Canada and what Wayne and Kim Annis and the whole world is doing with Y2Y and the Vital Ground, they're doing the same comprehensive programs of front country and back country. So it's really encouraging to watching these conservation problems heal. And we can see that we're doing all the same things. And I share Wayne's optimism that it'll eventually happen. And like I say, the reason I think it's slower is not only he had to start to rebuild the population and then connect it. So it's absolutely heroic in that regard. They've just, you know,
Thanks, Michael. It's good, some good perspective to be able to compare it to the success just to the north. Okay, so we have another good question here. So for Michael, at what scale is your grizzly bear research and data useful for land use planning? For example, there is a 4,500 hectare commercial tenure application for the Highway 31A corridor. Do you have data that could help us understand grizzly bear use at that scale and to predict the potential impacts of these kinds of commercial recreation development?
Yeah, I'm aware of that proposal, and I've already written about a 5-page data-based comment for the decision makers. You know, I see my job as not taking a stand one way or another, but providing solid information for society to judge and decision makers to decide. So I'm sort of putting forth the data. And so my work is, what's nice about our work is we've tried to make it multi-scale. So it's actually relevant down to a bear scale where Wayne can watch a bear move from the Selkirks into the Yak down into Idaho. But it's also relevant for a bigger scale where we can look at the cabinets up through Revelstoke, Revelstoke, British Columbia. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. We're not trying to join the United States, Revelstoke, Montana. But so, you know, it's very relevant for there. So I have very detailed habitat quality maps, and we've also I have detailed huckleberry patch maps for that area. And it does happen to be that that particular development is right smack dab over the very best habitat, the very best huckleberry patches, which actually amount to the only real corridor to what is sort of a semi-isolated, very small population just to the south of that resort. There's 4 sides to that population. 3 sides are sort of almost permanently cut off. One's by Kootenay Lake and a lot of development, and the west arm of Kootenay Lake with a lot of development, and the Slocan Valley and Slocan Lake with a lot of development. But there's excellent connectivity potential to the north. And so our data suggests that it would be nice to go with a light touch in that area. We'll see how the decision makers do, but I appreciate the question, and I'm on it, and we're gonna put our data in with input, not with a strong opinion one way or another, but with a good solid data base though.
Thanks, Michael. And then maybe Wayne can take this one, but I think it would be great for both of you to speak to it. So just another question about data and the application of data and conservation. Are there similar metrics in the US to the huckleberry patches that, Michael, you presented that compare grizzly bear use? And would this be a good similar metric for connectivity in areas where grizzly bears haven't been in years?
Okay, good question. So we are actually pursuing on the US side some of the same work that Michael did in British Columbia. And part of that was prompted because Michael did attempt to bring his map south of the border, but because of possibly some issues with the layers that are available, the way the data was collected, extrapolating his huckleberry model across the border to the south did not really work very well. So it's now 2 years ago, we started doing the same sort of sampling that Michael did in British Columbia in the Selkirks, the Yak, and the Cabinets, trying to identify what sort of patches of huckleberries that are out there that bears make maybe more than casual use of. What can bears tell us about the most important huckleberry patches in those 3 areas? So we have been doing field sampling for the previous 2 summers. We'll be out there again this summer in August doing field sampling again, so vegetation plot work and going to these sites to determine, is this a huckleberry site where these bears were spending time during the huckleberry foraging time of the year, and how much huckleberry is there, and what are some of the other features on the landscape that might contribute to this being a good huckleberry site, so we can develop that same predictive model on the US side. So long answer to basically say, yes, that's in the works here, but we're not as far along as Michael is at this point.
Great, thank you. Okay, another good question. So compared to other factors, to what degree has the Canada-US border itself acted as a barrier to 1, grizzly bear movement, and 2, conservation collaboration?
Well, the border itself is not a barrier to anything unless you try to get across right now with a passport. You can't get across. The settlement and development along the highways north of the border and of course South Highway 200 and Highway 2 and Highway 3 are the real fractures, and Highway 95 going north and 3A. But the border itself is not a big deal. The border that's a good question in the sense of what are the politics and the governments and the different cultures of conservation. How does that differ across countries that inhibit it? But I've been invited to many seminars and webinars and symposia around the world and in North America as talking about our example as an example of where it has worked really well. And, I'm a self-employed guy and didn't really have a job or want a job. And I bumped into Kasworm and Servine, and we joined forces because I thought it was a good match. And they were very willing. And the United States has been amazingly willing to invest money in some of the aspects of work across British Columbia. They don't hire me or anything, but they've helped with radio collaring, and they sent some people up to teach me how to do it. And we've had an amazing cross-culture, cross-boundary culture. And we share just about everything. We share all our data, we share analyses, we share ideas, we share problem solutions. So I think we're an example of how it can work. And I know a lot of other people look to us. I go out to the Western Washington and BC, and we talk about this all the time. So I don't think it's been much of a barrier at all, and I think it's been a benefit because Kasworm and crew have been doing this long before I have, and Montana has. So I have a old saying, you learn everything you need to know about life in kindergarten, but I say I learned everything I know about managing grizzly bears in Montana. So it's been really good for us.
Thanks, Michael. Wayne, did you have any burning thoughts to share about that?
Not much more than to say it's been a very good working relationship across the border. Obviously, the bears do not pay attention to the border. They go back and forth. We have different approaches to management on one side of the border versus the other, but I think, we have been working together, and, I think there have been some good strides made because of that collaboration across the border. It's not that we don't have a few more things to do, or certainly the job is not complete, but we've made tremendous progress.
Thanks, Wayne.
And I use the United States to guilt Canada into doing things, and it's probably done vice versa, because there's some things that are better in the States and some better in Canada. So, we use it to our advantage.
All right, so someone else asked, do you expect climate change to affect the bear habitats significantly? And do you think this will have an impact on medium or long-term movement and gene flow? Big question.
Go ahead, Wayne.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Go ahead, Michael. You beat me to it. You know, very good question. And obviously, in looking into the long term and how climate change is going to affect some of these things, boy, I'm not sure that I can really crystal ball that sort of thing. Obviously, I think climate change is going to affect some of the food production that's out there. The real question in my mind is whether there are going to be some places where it hurts food production, but there's also going to be some places where it benefits food production. I can see some habitats that maybe are dominated by Menziesea and other sorts of wetter site plants that actually shade out huckleberry. But if the climate becomes a little drier or changes, there may be places where huckleberry actually would benefit from some of those kinds of things, and that might be of value to bears. The real question here is, on balance, how do these pluses and minuses or income and outgo on the ledger really affect bears in the long run? And that's a tougher question, but bears are, in my opinion, bears are relatively well adapted to some of these things because they have such a wide variety of foods and a wide variety of habitats that bears use. And I think there are other species out there on the landscape that are going to experience greater impacts from climate change than grizzly bears. Not that it's a perfect world for grizzly bears, but I think it's going to be tougher on a lot of other things besides grizzly bears. And I'll let it go at that and let Michael add in.
Well, it's a good question, and it's a lot unknown. I think both Wayne and I are authors on one paper or another that talk about the relationship of huckleberries and climate change. And the one I'm on, I think we looked at huckleberries across the whole Northwest, and they're going to they predict a little shift north and a little shift upwards in elevation, but not as bad as I would have thought it could be. But I think that a lot of that is unknown. I know that Scott Nielsen has done some work suggesting there might be some benefits to huckleberries. So it's a bit unknown. And then, as Wayne suggested, there's the plant community. One is the ecological envelope of its niche, but the other is competition with other species. It'd be crazy. So one thing that I've tried to focus on is connectivity to let bears be able to move with ecosystem shifts. And that doesn't mean all the bears are going to run to one place, but we need to have them have access to the fuller, larger landscape. And that's why it's so important to me to work on connectivity. And that's why we've gotten into Kootenai Connect, trying to keep those corridors open for everything. We just need to let nature move. We're not doing very well at limiting carbon, although we've been doing pretty good in the last 2 months. I do see one other issue, and I think we've learned a little lesson here, as crises that might emanate from climate change, whatever they be, from climate migrants to climate refugees to disease or more storms. We tend to, I'm not saying that COVID is related to climate change or anything, but it does give us a window into disasters and things. We tend to think about our own health and economics first. So I hope that that our worry and response to disasters doesn't eliminate our ability to care about the environment. But I think we're also learning very clearly that taking care of our ecology and our environment is in our best interest from a climate change standpoint and human prosperity standpoint. I'm hoping that society is seeing the link, and let's face it, science is big in the news these days. It's pretty neat. It is being ignored in some quarters, but in many quarters it is front and center. So I find that a hopeful. If you guys or anybody is feeling they want to listen to some really unbelievably cool government science people, listen to Bonnie Henry and the BC medical chief officer. She is amazing, and BC has one of the better responses, and I think it's due to her style and credibility. She's elevated science amazingly, and just go in and listen to one of her newscasts and you just go, yeah. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks, Michael, and I appreciate the optimism from both of you. Okay, we have about 5 minutes and 2 more questions, so we might be able to get through both of them. The first is for Wayne. If the hope is for the next generation of the yak bears to cross the Kootenai, what are the barriers to that, and how can they be mitigated other than acquiring easements such as the Stimson one several years ago?
And so, you know, the habitat protections are pretty important, but in addition to the habitat protections, I mean, we focus a lot of our management response in some of those areas. For instance, our bear management specialist, Kim Annis, you know, works hard in some of those areas to provide cost share electric fencing, to provide loaner garbage cans, to educate people that live in some of those areas to avoid being a place where bears might come, get into a conflict and potentially have to be removed. Electric fencing around chicken coops, a variety of different sort of things that need to happen in those areas. I mean, in number one, you have to protect the habitat, but number two, you also have to provide protections to the bears when they get into that habitat that you've created for them, and that opportunity to move across some of those fracture areas. And so those are at least a couple of the areas where we are working to protect bears once they get there.
Thanks. Okay, and then we'll sneak this last question in and then wrap up. So this one's for Michael. Does your new M1, M5 map replace the density map in the 2017 BC Auditor General Report? And will it be the new baseline in the promised provincial grizzly bear management plan?
It's not a density map. It's just a conservation ranking map. So it has nothing to do with density, really. I know I did say that those red populations had very low densities, but some populations that are healthy have low densities, and some populations that aren't have high density. But the other part of your question is that, yes, it is the official new conservation status map. I'm not sure if it's been released. I was given permission to include it in a publication. I just published a peer review look at access management in Canada, and I was given permission to include that map. So that means it is, but I'm not, and we're going to write that process up as a paper. You know, governments are slow to release data. They sometimes for very good reason. They like to really make sure they understand all facets of it and look at it from many perspectives. But it's supposed to be the official assessment. And
Great, thank you. And then a lot of people just in the chat saying that they really appreciated your time and the information that you both shared today, which I will echo. Thank you so much for being here today and for presenting to everyone. And I think if you have anything else to say, you can say it now, or we will wrap up.
thank you.
Yes, I would give a thank you to all the participants here today, and thanks for being interested in grizzly bears in this transboundary area.
Thanks so much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.